How do you hold on to who you are when your home is a prize in somebody else's fight? With everything that's going on in the world today, it's a hard question to avoid, right? When you're thinking about all these towns that are reduced to rubble along the Ukraine-Russia border, when you're hearing about lives upturned in the Gaza Strip, don't you wonder, how must life be completely changed when you're caught in the crossfire of bigger forces than yourself? Well, history has a little bit to teach us about that. Hi, I'm Justine, the nerdy half of the Breakaway Bravehearts. And today I'm in Denbigh and Prestatyn, two small towns in North Wales that can teach us a little bit about what it's like to live in the front lines of conflict. What today is just suburban Britain used to be the borderlines of two warring nations. This deep dive is a little bit of a different format to what we normally do. If you're one of our regular subscribers, firstly, thank you, but you'll know that we normally do more of a relaxed kind of travel vlog, enjoying the places we go to, but at the same time trying to learn from their history and their culture. But I'm the nerdy half, and every now and then I come across some issues that I just want to know more about. And this idea of living in a border town, particularly because there is so much happening in the world today that really relates to that, I needed to know more. And I wanted to know what Wales could teach me. What I'm hoping you'll do for me is leave me heaps of feedback. Looking forward to reading your thoughts. But let's get started. We are starting appropriately at a statue named Dechrau, or in English, the beginning and the end. Because first of all, we need to work out, how did Wales and England become separate entities in the first place in order to need a border? How did Prestatyn, where we are now, end up maintaining its indigenous population and yet become a crucial border town in the emerging nations of Wales and England? The Welsh are widely regarded as descendants of the indigenous Britons who roamed the lands before all of the migration and invasions that created Britain as we know it today. As successions of Celts, Romans, Germanic tribes, Vikings and Normans all pushed into Britain, the Welsh got forced over the mountains, and that created a little bit of a refuge. Protected by the rugged terrain and the relative isolation, these people were able to hold on to their language and their culture and their tradition for far longer than the other inhabitants of Britain. So they were able to hold on to their own strong sense of identity. And over the centuries, the nation of Wales emerged from a patchwork of kingdoms ruled over by princes who each shared a language and legal traditions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountains, the locals were merging with the settlers and the invaders to create a new English identity and a new set of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One of these was the Kingdom of Mercia, which was settled by a group of Anglo-Saxons who created a kingdom in the kind of central western Midlands of what is now England. Mercia arose from contested space between the native Britons on one side and the settlers, Anglo-Saxon, and created this kind of group of boundary folk, border people, hence the name Mercia, from an Old English word meaning border. Over the centuries, Mercia kept expanding its territory through both alliances and military campaigns, just chipping away at that land across the border, taking it away from the native Britons. And by the 7th and 8th century, it was a dominant power, with leaders like Penda and Offa, who kept pushing those indigenous tribes back across the mountains. And to make sure that they didn't try and creep back again, Offa decided to draw a line in the sand, or in this case, a literal line in the earth. He instructed his men to start digging. Mercia set to work, creating an ambitious piece of earthwork, a huge ditch that would mark out the Western Territory and separate English-held land from Welsh land. Offa must have been more of a practical man than one concerned with leaving glorious legacies. Rather than build a wall like Hadrian, he decided just to dig a ditch and move the earth out of the ground, creating a bank. This was going to be much quicker and more cost effective. Life in Prestatyn while Offa was building his dike was continuously disrupted. They were mainly farmers or fishermen living in small wooden huts, and the community was quite diverse, other than a small village that held that communal social life. The ditch was built simultaneously in all the small towns and took about 4 summers to complete. Building of the dike involved a mass labour mobilisation. Although most of this was from the Anglo-Saxon side, the Welsh side could see this major change in their landscape. They would have experienced the clearing of trees, large earthworks, and probably cut off access to their traditional lands. As the dike grew and divided the territory, it also divided families and trade routes, and basically upset the daily society and interaction of local groups, because now there was a place to enforce border control. The Welsh were supposed to stay on their side, and there was strict punishment enforced if they tried to cross the dike. But all this did was reinforce that Welsh cultural identity and make it even stronger than before. It gave the Welsh even more reason to stand together united against those that were trying to enforce through fear from the outside. When you control groups and force them into a contained area, all you do is help them grow a stronger bond together. The Welsh community developed a heightened sense of cultural identity and unity because of their exclusion from the Mercian lands, and now a shared enemy. If you look at oral legends and chronicles of the time, you can see there was a fear of Mercian justice, but also a growing pride in Welsh autonomy. The border served to foster resilience and resistance. Offa's dike reduced the conflict, but it didn't stop it. The Mercians continued to push westward, and local Welsh leaders showed resistance and tried to push back. So for the people of Prestatyn, you were constantly thinking about when was the next conflict. You were subject to skirmishes and political manoeuvres, never knowing what was happening next. Meanwhile, England transformed when in 1066 the Normans arrived. William the Conqueror very quickly set up points at Hereford, Shrewsbury and Chester along that border to act as buffer zones, but also as push-off points for future invasions. He gave their rulers exceptional powers and military responsibilities. On the English side, the dike became known as the Marches, from the Latin marca, meaning border. The border became a patchwork of towns, lordships and castles, but it was still far from a fixed line. During the Middle Ages, it was a shifting frontier with competing rulers going back and forth, with land changing hands thanks to raids or marriages. The market town of Denbigh found itself right in the middle. Denbigh's significance as a border town really accelerated after Edward I's conquest of Wales in the late 13th century. Don't know if you can see behind the suburban rooftops there are the remains of a medieval castle. Let's go check it out. After his victory in 1282, Edward launched a systematic campaign to cement English control over North Wales. Edward decided to cement his control with a famous iron ring of castles, including castles at Beaumaris in Anglesey, Conwy along the coast of North Wales, and Denbigh. You can visit all of these castles today, and I highly recommend it. Hello. Hi! I've popped some video links above and below for you to check them out, and I've also put the Cardu website below. That's the Wales National Trust, and they look after these historical landmarks, and they manage them very, very well. I do recommend a visit. So why Denbigh? Strategically, it commanded key routes and controlled the Clwyd Valley, not just a fertile farmland, but a gateway between the Welsh mountains and the English heartlands. Building a castle here was more than just military defence. It was an unmistakable statement. The English are here now, you can tell from the stone and the soldiers. By 1295, this massive castle had a triple tower gate and was full of the latest military technology. But stone walls were not enough. The English really know how to take control when they want to. They decided to take the titles of the Welsh as well, and the Prince of Wales now became an English title. In 1301, Edward I gave the title of Prince of Wales to his own son, Edward II, thereby showing Wales that he meant business. He was in control now. So the castle walls and the town's defensive barriers were far more than military constructions. They were physical stamps of power, constant reminders that you were now living in a contested borderland, where Welsh autonomy clashed directly with English ambition. So these walls witnessed not just sieges and rebellions, but also the everyday lives of a people in a border town where identity isn't straightforward. Denbigh's community was trapped between two worlds. Near the castle and within the walls was the English garrison, stationed here in increasing numbers. And at the same time, English settlers were coming in and taking up some of the farmland around the outside of the walls. Meanwhile, the Welsh community had their own little township. This division shaped political authority, but it also impacted on how people saw themselves. Within the Welsh community, the Welsh language, their cultures, their traditions survived despite the increasing outside pressure. And perhaps even because of it in some cases, as people felt even more strongly about holding on to those old ideas. What did Welshness mean living here in the shadow of English castles flying English flags? This isn't a simple story of Welsh villagers fighting against English invaders with clear-cut loyalties. Allegiance here is a lot more complicated. It comes down to family ties, survival, economics, politics, and sometimes coercion. It's less about nationalism as we think of it today, and more of a pragmatic choice made in uncertain and sometimes dangerous times. You might speak Welsh at home and celebrate Welsh traditions, but when you go to work, you have to trade in English, follow English laws and customs, and keep your English customers happy. This meant people often created a kind of hybrid identity, one that was sometimes contested internally, as often you had to pick sides. People found ways to help one another, sharing resources or creating secret communities and underground practices that kept their traditions and their language alive. For most people, resistance was about quiet defiance. But then there were some people who decided that quiet wasn't changing things. These were usually people who already had a little bit of power. People like Owain Glyndwr. Glyndwr's uprising started partly out of a land dispute with the English Lord Baron Grey of Ruthin. Baron Grey laid claim to some of Glyndwr's property in Denbighshire, and then, just to make matters worse, he held back a royal summons that should have gone to him. To Glyndwr, this wasn't just petty scheming, it was a direct insult. And it wasn't how things were supposed to work between lords. That personal grudge lit a fuse that sparked a rebellion right across Wales. The legacy of Glyndwr's rebellion is not just a page in Welsh history books. It's a family drama that continued throughout generations. It's a reminder that life in border towns isn't just about political headlines in the newspapers. It's something that goes on in the homes of the daily lives of those people. For many, life was a complex balancing act. If your family members or your marriage partners were swept up in the rebellion, you felt the pressure to join. But if your financial security depended on your English customers and your English lords, then you were in a tricky situation. If you were seen to side with the rebels, your property could be seized, your trade could be ended, your security gone. So for many, while you might have been internally in your heart supporting Welsh independence, perhaps you feared for the future. The outcome was a blend. English laws and Welsh customs, Welsh language at home, and English coin at the marketplace. Resilience in private, but allegiance in public. So as we walk through these streets, we can imagine those layers, a community living through divided days, doing their best to find a path that lets them survive, and if possible, just hang on to a bit of pride and belonging. So for most people, it probably didn't feel like they had a choice at all. If you're an English soldier and you were stationed here as part of the garrison, well, it was pretty clear which side you had to be in, no matter what you believed. And if you were a local farmer and there's armies marching through your fields or your markets have been shut down, you just want to feed your family. You don't have time to be thinking about the political debates of princely feuds. And local elites couldn't risk waffling either. Their status came from the king, and they risked everything if there was even a suspicion of disloyalty. Glyndwr's rebellion quickly divided families of any social structure. Take, for example, the wealthy Salisbury family. Now, they had roots here in Denbigh, and they had property holdings both inside and outside the castle walls. And you can find records of this family in local politics, in property transactions, in the town's history. For a long time, the family tried to maintain dual identities. They embraced English laws and political systems for their financial dealings, but at home they kept their Welsh language traditions and their family culture. And then the rebellion struck. Some of the families sided with Glyndwr, wanting to see Welsh independence again. Others of the family supported the English because those were the ones that had brought them the wealth in the first place. Their decisions weren't fueled by pride and blood alone. By now it was a practical concern. It likely split the family in half. You can imagine the dinner time tension. This internal rift within families didn't just fade after the rebellion. It created hard rivalries throughout ongoing generations. Even into the late 16th century, the Salisbury family was still going at it, with their rivalries spilling into duels and political battles as each different side of the family fought for land, power, and honour. When you can look at it from this historical distance, you can see that kind of heartbreaking story that must be going on in the homes of those living in the borders today. Yes, there are important aspects of self-determination, cultural and Indigenous rights, and religious beliefs. And at the same time, most people are just trying to survive. They're reacting to events outside of their control. They've got family and economic pressures, and they're reacting out of fear. So when we read the headlines, understanding what's going on for those people helps bring that new perspective to what Trump or Netanyahu or the others might tell us. And the history of Denbigh has much more to teach us, because just a couple of centuries later, this community was caught in the crossfire again. And this time the situation was very different. By the time the War of the Roses broke out in 1455, Denbigh was living a whole different world. There had been a generation born and grown up since the time of Owain Glyndwr's uprising. And now their children, the grandchildren who fought in Glyndwr's time, now had to fight again, but this time not under the banner of Welsh independence. They were drawn into a fight between two rival English factions. Yet the echoes of the earlier revolt were still in the air. Towns like Denbigh and Prestatyn were now well entrenched under English rule, and the growing mix of Welsh and English inhabitants, tensions were often evident. Welsh language and customs were mainly found in the rural areas, but in the towns, the law, the administration was primarily in English language, run by the English for the benefit of English families. By the mid-15th century, the town had been pulled into the War of the Roses, a brutal civil war between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists that tore England apart and spilled into Wales as well. Denbigh and its castle found themselves caught in the shifting tides of power. The town and fortress were fiercely contested, Jasper Tudor, a leading Lancastrian and a key figure with strong Welsh connections, was declared Constable of Denbigh Castle in 1457 by Henry VI. But the castle was largely held by Yorkist forces, and control struggled back and forth. In 1460, Jasper took it, but then by 61, the Yorks had taken it back again. In 1468, Jasper Tudor returned. Unable to take the castle again, he just set fire to everything inside the walled town. This, of course, created devastation and sent everybody out of the town down the hill, creating what is now modern Denbigh. The old town itself was largely abandoned by the century's end, a scar of war woven into the fabric of Denbigh's story. These battles aren't just about rival kings. They tore at families, neighbours and communities in Denbigh. The ancestors of those walking past us on the streets today might have fought on different sides or been caught in the crossfire as the castle changed hands multiple times. Fast forward to the English Civil War in the 1640s, and Denbigh again played a strategic role. The castle became a royalist garrison, and apparently the soldiers weren't that well behaved. Town records show them drunkenly spilling into the town streets, causing havoc amongst the locals. The townsfolk had to billet the soldiers, and this disrupted their daily life immensely, especially during times of siege when there wasn't a lot of food to go around. There's a lot of records of the soldiers disrupting the markets and generally just causing fear. Townsfolk were walking a bit of a tightrope amidst all this chaos. Historical records show a lot of petitions from people just seeking relief from all the hardships and strain that was placed on them, from the politics of people who bore little resemblance to who they were. Petitions from Denbighshire residents from this period reveal a community trying to survive war's pressures. One vivid example is Captain Richard Vaughan from Llanwrst, a market town about 20 miles northwest of Denbigh. Vaughan was a staunch royalist who fought on the side of King Charles I, but he was wounded and lost his sight and faced debilitating injuries. When the fighting ended and the parliamentarians took control, Vaughan returned home in what he called his present deplorable condition, unable to work or support his family. In 1660, when Charles II was returned to the throne, he sent a desperate petition to the Denbigh justices begging for help. And remarkably, his plea was heard. He was granted a pension of £10 a year. At the time, that was actually the highest pension given to any wounded soldier. Vaughan became known as the Blind Captain and was even invited up to Windsor to live as one of the poor knights. And he stayed up there on his pension right up until his death in 1700s. Vaughan's story reminds us of the struggles of family who have to rebuild after the war have ended, after, in modern days, the media has left and the story has ended for the outside world. For those who survived the story while it happened, there is still a lot more to be said. When you step back and look at the history of small border towns, you realise it's really not just about who won which battle and which king was sitting on the throne. It's about those people who had to deal with that push and pull of power, trying to just survive their daily lives. And from now on, moving forward, the battles that they fought in weren't about resisting English conquest. They were fighting within British armies overseas. And of course, an identity that's formed during conflict is going to spill over into future generations. And that's what I'm going to look at in my next deep dive. What can we learn from today's Welsh identity about how identity is formed once your country has been subsumed or colonised, when your nation is now part of a bigger nation, when being Welsh now also means being British. I really hope you join me for that. I'm hoping to make more of these deep dives into different issues as we go. So if you haven't hit subscribe yet, do so, and the notifications bell. But most importantly, please leave me a comment, give me some feedback. How is this format working for you? Are there more things you'd like to find out more about? I'm also going to need another sign off. I usually say, happy travels everyone, but the deep dives are less about travel and more about history. Happy history everyone sounds a bit lame. If you can think of another sign off for me, please let me know in the comments below. But for now, till next time, ngā mihi nui.